Today is one of those days in the church. Today is one of those days in the church calendar that has three different names. Today is, well, actually it has four now that I think about it. Today is the presentation of Christ in the temple, or the purification of St. Mary the Virgin, or Candlemas, or simply the fourth Sunday after Epiphany. What I want to do this morning is I want to take you through the purification of the Blessed Virgin and show you what's taking place in this very important event that Luke records for us. First, let me give you just a couple of bullet points. Jesus is circumcised on the 8th day, according to the law, Genesis 17, 9 through 14, and Leviticus 12, 3. Mary and Joseph give Jesus the name Gabriel instructed them to give him. Mary follows and fulfills the Old Testament purification laws, Leviticus 12. Jesus is brought up to Jerusalem to be redeemed or consecrated to the Lord, Exodus 13, 2, 12, and 15. Mary offers the appropriate sacrifice for her purification, according to Leviticus 12. And then they pay the ransom price of 5 shekels to consecrate Jesus. The background for this particular event in the gospel is Leviticus. So, as much as it pains you to hear this, you gotta read Leviticus 12 and 15 if you truly want to understand the significance of what we will be talking about. Luke makes it clear that what is taking place here is a direct result of God's intrusion into the earthly sphere, commanding his messenger Gabriel to inform Mary that the one who she is carrying would be named Jesus, and he would be called the Son of God, and is therefore holy. Now, it isn't that simple, because according to Old Testament law, secretions from the body that occur at giving birth make the mother unclean, and we'll get into that in a second. Thus, as I said, this event should be read within the context of Leviticus 12 and 15, which also deals with all bodily secretions. So, even though the Mosaic law says it's perfectly fine for men to get married and the high priest was encouraged to be married, it treats everything related to sexual relations, generation, birth, etc. as defiling, because sin has corrupted not only the individual but the entire race. Therefore, as long as a woman who had given birth was still in some sense discharging, she was considered ceremonially impure and therefore not permitted to enter the sanctuary. Now, there are two things at the beginning that we need to look at. First is the purification of Mary, and second is the offering of the child. So, after the birth of a son, the mother was ceremonially unclean for 7 days. And if you think that's bad, if she had a daughter, it would be 14. On the 8th day at the circumcision, her ceremonial uncleanness would be purified, but she still had to remain at home for a further 33 days to complete the purification process. And if it was a daughter, it was 66 days. Then on the 40th day, and that number 40 should jump out at you, and we'll talk about it in a second, she offered her sacrifice at the Nicanor gate on the east end of the court of women. So according to Leviticus 12, then after giving birth to a son, it wasn't until the 40th day that the time of her purification was completed, by means of offerings, that she was then restored to full communion with the worshiping multitude. Now during this time, she was not permitted to enter the outer court or touch any holy object. And this presentation included the redemption price of a ransom fee. So think about this. On the 40th day, the Redeemer of the universe was himself redeemed. Strange as that may sound, it is true. Now, obviously, his was not a redemption as our redemption. He was not going to endure the same redemption that he would be offering to his people to redeem them. Yet, being his mother's firstborn son and belonging to the tribe, not of Levi, but of Judah, he had to be exempted from official temple service by the payment of 5 shekels of silver. And you can see that in Exodus 13, Numbers 3, etc. Now, depending upon the current exchange rate, we're talking about a payment of about 6 months' salary. That is a steep redemption price. You have the offering of the child. Now, this offering was in accordance with the law requiring that each firstborn child was to be offered to God, and a price was to be paid for the child's redemption. The law, Exodus 13, 34, Numbers 3, required that the firstborn of both animals and men be offered in sacrifice to Yahweh. Now, obviously, they weren't going to kill each of these, the animal maybe. The choice of Levi as a sacred tribe was regarded as a substitute for the offering of the firstborn of men. But at the same time, a ransom price of 5 shekels was necessary. Now, it's interesting to keep this in mind when you consider the event taking place. The visit of Joseph and Mary and Jesus to Jerusalem probably preceded the visit of the wise men from the east. Because in that there was the warning in connection with Herod that they would probably not have come to Jerusalem to perform this ceremony. And would they, when you think about it, after receiving all of those costly gifts from these wise men, would they have only sacrificed 2 pigeons? So this was very early on. It is also, at this point, we see the beginning of the humiliation of Jesus. The reality of the incarnation is that it rendered Mary impure according to Jewish law. And since this offering is the one usually made by the poor, Jesus then is identified with those poor in spirit and financially, the very people he reached out to save. Luke's account of the presentation of the temple underscores the fulfillment of all that the law required at the birth of a child. From the very beginning of his life, he was dedicated in every detail to the commandments of God. Even as a baby, he was submitted by his parents to the minutest requirements of the Old Testament law. In the life of Jesus, we see one who is dedicated completely and totally to fulfill every obligation that God laid upon his people. Even circumcision, instituted by God as a sign of his covenant with Abraham, is fulfilled in Christ. By this act, the male child was formally initiated into the body of the covenant people. The one who made the covenant now is circumcised to become a member of that covenant. Now, what's the symbolism behind this? The sacrifices obviously symbolize that the sacrificer deserved death, but that the sacrificial animal is loaded with the guilt and death penalty. And for the sake of the sacrifice, in his place enters upon death to set the sacrificer free from his guilt. Now, according to Exodus 13, a sacrifice always was to be offered for the firstborn to symbolize the fact that the death penalty lay on him and had to be taken away through the sacrifice. This sacrifice is brought in the case of Jesus because he has taken upon himself the death penalty of the sinful people for whose salvation he became man. The underlying idea of the redemption was rooted in this. And we all know it was the night of the Israelites' deliverance from the house of bondage, where all firstborn Egyptians were slain in Exodus 12. However, in God's holy sight, not only the Egyptians, but also the Israelites had forfeited their firstborn. In place of death, Yahweh was willing to accept the tribe of Levi in lifelong service in the tabernacle and later the temple, and from the firstborn of the other tribes, 5 shekels, as one symbolic offering, a confession, as it were, was to be offered. Even Jesus himself was under the sentence of death. He was born under the law, Galatians 4. Not only of being under personal obligation to keep the law, but also of being duty-bound. A duty, by the way, to which he voluntarily obligated himself, to which he was voluntarily to bear the law's penalty and to satisfy its demand of perfect obedience for us. His consecration, as we have seen previously when I preached to you, is parallel to that of Samuel. The calling out of the child, the presentation of the child, and the prophets coming to bless the child, all parallels 1 Samuel 1:24. Now, let's look at the purification, because this is what usually sets people off. Impurity in the Israelite religion was a sign of moral failing and physical infirmity in all of humanity. Moral failure represented Israel's disobedience, their violation of God's prohibitive commandments. In the Israelite mind, and this is what's important when we come to this purification of Mary, at the birth of Jesus, blood was the chief symbol of life, Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12. And though not technically polluting one, bleeding or touching blood was a stark symbol of death. The only bodily emissions that pollute are blood from a menstrual cycle, and the second one, I'm simply going to give you the reference, and you can look it up at home because I'm not going to say it in public, Leviticus 15:16. But it has to do with how somebody gets pregnant, so you can put 2 and 2 together. Thus, biblical impurity and holiness are seen as opposites. So the fight then switches. Our fight changes from a cosmic struggle against benevolent and demonic deities of pagans, Israel's pagan neighbors, to the forces of life and death, set loose by people themselves through their own obedience or defiance of God's commandments. As the child is brought to be circumcised, circumcision, a sign of the covenant and initiation right into the religious bond between Israel and its God, takes place, that the uncircumcised, now consider this, may not participate in the paschal sacrifice. Circumcision, the paschal sacrifice, redemption was for the Jews. Circumcision was even required of non-Israelite bridegrooms. Think of Dinah. Now that was more than just a ruse to kill all of those people. It indicated that the covenant idea was associated with circumcision from the very beginning of Jewish practice. It was that important. Now here's the real backdrop to all of this. In the Jewish mind, the contrast is between life and death. That is at the heart of the clean and unclean laws. Life and death are baked into an understanding of what it means to be clean and unclean. Yahweh is the fountain of life. This relationship can be viewed on a type of spectrum of life and death. And we can even, if you will, represent it spatially, with life in the ordered cosmos at the one end, and death and chaos and Sheol at the other. The nearer one approaches Yahweh, the closer one gets to life in abundance. The further one is driven from him, the more deeply death and chaos are experienced. This spatial imagery is seen over and over in Scripture. And if you were at my Bible study last year, you know we talked about this. Eden. Remember the Edenic sanctuary up on the mountain. And then as we move away from God's house, there's the garden. And then we move out to what? The rest of the world. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those examples again, but this threefold identity is all over Scripture. The Holy of Holies then corresponds to the clouded summit of Mount Sinai. That cloud that carried the mobile chariot, the mobile throne room of God, descending upon the top of Mount Sinai. And then we have the next level, the holy place where the elders and Joshua met. And then at the bottom was the outermost area where the Jews and the rest of the world existed. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, at the opposite end of these pinnacles of relationship and dwelling with Yahweh is the wilderness, the realm of chaos, death, and Sheol. What is clean may be brought into God's presence at the entrance of the tabernacle, the courtyard before the altar or the temple, the outer court, court of the Gentiles. But before coming near him, one must be sanctified. They must be made holy so as to belong to Yahweh. So then what is unclean lies closer to death and chaos, and what is clean is closer to the life of Yahweh. And even beyond that, beyond the status of just being clean, is that of which is holy, and then most holy, which is nearest to Yahweh, who is himself absolute life and holiness. Those that are clean are in some way, those that are unclean in some way carry an aura of death about them, in that they manifest in the Jewish mindset less than physical wholeness. And also, certain physical defects eliminate a descendant of Aaron from serving as the high priest, since he represents original or restored creation and must be perfect as a man, if he is to be a priest. Various conditions, such as skin diseases, make Israelites unclean because it brings them into the realm of death. Remember Miriam and her little what happened to her? Her leprosy, when Aaron prayed, please do not let her be as one as dead. His flesh is half consumed. Remember the prohibitions against the leper when he was pronounced unclean, required to go into mourning, disheveling his hair, rending his clothes, being exiled out the camp of Israel, and if he is approached, he or she, in this case we don't discriminate, is supposed to cry out, unclean, unclean, to warn people away. In essence, such a person experienced a living death. These discharges of bodily fluids such as blood, along with what a woman secretes after childbirth, may be correlated then with an understanding of the loss of life. Something is oozing, life, blood is oozing out of them, and blood is associated with life. And this renders one unfit to be in the presence of Yahweh. And to be driven into the wilderness is to be driven away from God and to be driven to death. The need to separate life from death, the unclean from the holy, helps explain why the high priest must never have contact with a corpse. Death defiles. Depending on the severity of the uncleanness, it may require merely washing and waiting until evening, or purification offerings, the person remaining unclean for 7 days, or even being banished from the camp of Israel. Read Genesis 30, 19, and 20, and this will give you an understanding as to how this understanding of moving from life to death and flowing life from something. The Torah is seen as having life flown from it, a path of life to Yahweh, and it leads directly into Israel's covenant relationship. The life and wholeness versus death and chaos is also connected with and also understood to be in relation with life and death with sin. Life with holiness and death with sin. Think about this. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu, by the way, immediately preceding all of the clean and unclean laws, are set within the context of God's holiness. Indeed, Yahweh has Moses interpret their deaths to Aaron, saying, "By those who draw near to me, I must be regarded as holy." Leviticus 10. An admonition that permeates the atmosphere of the Day of Atonement. Remember, Aaron had to be perfect. The flood, for example, not only served to judge sinners, but also to cleanse, at least figuratively, the entire cosmos from sin's pollution. A universal baptism, if you will. Indeed, Yahweh's retreat after the fall, when he left and did not come back until the top of Mount Sinai when he gave instructions for the tabernacle, can be understood as a result of sin's effect in the pollution of earth, and he had to withdraw. That is why a sacred space, the tabernacle and later the temple, had to be constructed and consecrated in order for Yahweh to dwell in the midst of Israel. And the direct relationship of the covenant relationship with Yahweh was cleanness as a necessary result of Israel's divine redemption and consecration. One person who was unclean is one who was not allowed to appear in the presence of Yahweh to partake in the divine service. More than this, human beings, by virtue of being part of this sin-cursed fallen world, this is us, folks, are unclean and or contaminated and are not automatically eligible to approach God. In other words, man's normal state, our normal condition, is uncleanness. So now think about that as I conclude in relationship to what was taking place with Mary. As she comes forward for purification, she was drawing near to God. She needed to be clean to approach God. She needed to bring her son to be consecrated, to be redeemed. And at 40 days, there would have been a sacrifice and a payment, a substantial payment, to ensure that her son could approach the Holy One. Therefore, in this day of purification, Mary and Joseph meticulously obey the law of God. They purified themselves so they may approach God. They bring the sacrifice in order to consecrate Jesus, the Son of God, to his Father in heaven. Redeem him for and from the curse of the law. To manifest, to reveal in this Epiphany season the humiliation Jesus had to endure to identify with his people, us, in poverty, so that we might live with him in spiritual richness. The fulfillment of this ritual of Jewish law brings cleanness from uncleanness, life from death, holiness from unholiness, salvation from sin, and draws us to the source of all life and all holiness, the triune Godhead, by the work of the Son,